Democracy in talk radio. Of, for, and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon. Every week on Deadline DC, we talk to the progressive people and players who drive our nation's politics and policy forward. The show, I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a political commentator for news radio stations KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. If you have any ideas about the show, or if you want to find out anything more about my political polling company, Bannon Communications, the best way to reach me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @BradBannon, all one word. This week on Deadline DC, we have a really big show for you. In the first half hour, our guest is John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. He's here to talk about politics. Then in the second half hour, we'll talk about economics with Dr. Robert Shapiro. First, though, we have this clip. We're going to talk about the California recall election, and we have this clip from Governor Gavin Newsom, who survived a challenge to his tenure as governor of California.
And I think about just in the last, few days, and the former president put out saying this election was rigged. Democracy is not a football. You don't throw it around. It's more like antique vase. You could drop it and smash it in a million different pieces. And that's what we're capable of doing if we don't stand up to meet the moment and push back. I said this many, many times on the campaign trail. We may have defeated Trump, but Trumpism is not dead in this country. The big lie, January 6th insurrection, all the voting suppression efforts that are happening all across this country, what's happening, the assault on fundamental rights, constitutionally protected rights of women and girls. It's a remarkable moment in our nation's history.
That was Governor Gavin Newsom of California. Now it's Nichols time. Yeah. Our guest in this half hour is John Nichols, the National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. The Nation is home to tenacious muckraking, provocative commentary. The Nation empowers its readers to fight for justice and equality for all. John is the author of many books, including his most recent, which is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. His Twitter handle is Nichols, Nichols, Nichols Uprising. John, welcome back to Deadline DC.
It's great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Let's start with last week, Governor Gavin Newsom, who we just heard from, survived a recall election. He won the right to serve the remainder of his term, which sounds interesting, actually, by a decisive margin. The Republican opposition crashed and burned. Now, a lot of people, including myself, were cheered by Newsom's decisive victory. Now, we all know California is a bright blue state. So is there anything we can learn from a decisive victory in a very strongly Democratic state, or should we just move on to the next one?
No, we can learn an immense amount. This was a highly significant election, and the results tell us a great deal about what's possible in politics at this point, but also what some of the tripwires are. The thing to understand is that the recall effort against Newsom sought to take advantage of the rules in California. And that's the first thing to recognize as regards Republicans at this point. They are looking for vulnerabilities in election rules, election structures that will allow them to achieve wins, quote unquote, that they would not otherwise achieve. In California, they have a mess of a recall system. It allows you to get on the ballot for a recall very, very easily, which I don't mind that much. But then once you've done so, it sets up two elections. First, an election to decide whether to keep the person being recalled. And then second, another election to determine who you will replace the recalled individual if the majority vote in the first one to remove. You're already understanding the complexity just as I describe it. And the Republicans hoped that they could fly under radar, have a low turnout in a complex election process, get enough people to vote to recall Newsom, and then with a tiny portion of the electorate, install a right-wing governor. And polls suggest they were actually doing pretty well at this until late in the game when Larry Elder, the conservative talk radio host, stepped up and became the clear Republican front runner on that second vote. That allowed Newsom and the Democrats to generate what was something much more akin to a normal campaign, a Democratic candidate against a right-wing Republican. Once that happened, Newsom took off. And so the two lessons you take away from California are, first, the Republicans are going to keep trying to game the system. They will do it in all sorts of ways. You shouldn't just focus on voter suppression. You should also understand that there's a lot of other strategies that they will use to try and upend Democrats, even in places where Democrats are relatively solid, where voting patterns tend to be very Democratic, such as California. Second, the way to beat the Republicans in 2022 is to make it clear that this is a competition between a Democrat and a Trump Republican. And that's what happened in California. Larry Elder really ran as sort of an uber Trump type candidate. And that made it very easy for Newsom to excite and engage the Democratic electorate, generate a big turnout, and win. That's going to be a reality, not just in California, but in states across the country in 2022.
Okay, I spent some time looking at the exit polls in California. The number one issue for California voters as they participated in the recall was the pandemic. That was the number one issue for California voters, and 80% of the voters who were concerned about the pandemic, which was the number one issue, voted no on the recall. Do you think that will have any effect nationally on encouraging some people, maybe some governors, to be aggressive fighting the Delta variant? Or is it just a lesson that Democrats will pay attention to and Republicans like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott will just blithely ignore?
A couple of things there. First, it's important to understand there are some Republican governors who will likely be on the ballot in 2022, who have been pretty aggressive in taking on COVID. This is one of the places where the Republican Party has divided at a very intense level. In New England, you see Republican governors like Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, who've been, not perfect. I've actually written things that have been critical of Baker, but by and large, better, certainly than what Donald Trump was, and comparable, at least in some cases, to Democrats. You've got, the governor in Maryland, the governor in Vermont, Republicans, governor in Ohio, a Republican, DeWine, who have been, more responsive to the need to address COVID. I think the California result will encourage Republicans like that to, double down on what they've been doing. It makes sense. It's clear politically that for a November election, being good on COVID matters, being on top of it. But there are going to be a lot of Republicans who don't, because this has become the real, kind of primary election dividing line in the Republican Party. And it's clear there's a fanatical base that is angry about masks, angry about vaccinations, very resistant, very hesitant. And if we understand that, if we recognize that, then that becomes a big deal for Democrats, because in a number of states around the country, it will be possible for Democrats to run on a strong COVID message and say, look, this is a lingering problem. It may by November of 2022 be less of an issue, but it will probably still be a concern and something that people are conscious of. And so for Democrats, I think doubling down on the issue, going deeper, making a big deal about it matters. And I think you're going to see that in Florida as an example, where a couple of Democratic candidates are running.
John, we're going to go to a brief break now for our radio listeners. If you're watching us on TV, please stay tuned because we're not going anywhere. We'll be right back with more of John Nichols, political affairs correspondent for The Nation, and Deadline DC with Brad Bannon right after these messages.
I want to get back to seeing my grandbabies every Sunday and smothering them with big hugs and kisses.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is John Nichols, National Affairs correspondent for The Nation. John, we just talked about California. The next big test, we have gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia this year. Everybody assumes that Phil Murphy, the Democratic governor of New Jersey, will be reelected. In Virginia, we have a very tight gubernatorial campaign. The Democratic candidate is the former governor, Terry McAuliffe. The Washington Post just released a survey of Virginia voters, and they showed a very tough race, very tight race, with McAuliffe at 50%, the Republican candidate John Youngkin at 47%. What does that race look like for you? I mean, Virginia is a much more competitive state, partisan terms than California. It looks like we have a tough, tight race there.
Sure. I mean, I think that, we're early in the race in Virginia. Remember, you've still got about a month and a half before Election Day. Obviously, some early voting will begin sooner. McAuliffe is, I think that after he got the Democratic nomination, there was a sense that he was going to have a relatively easy ride. That's because his opponent, while very, very wealthy and very well funded, is a relative newcomer, and McAuliffe a known entity. It's clear in Virginia that McAuliffe is going to have to do the mobilization and work hard. So having polls like this right now for McAuliffe are good. This is healthy because it will cause Democrats in Virginia to kind of get up, get energized, get serious about the race in a way that they might not have otherwise. The other issue in Virginia that I think is going to be a very big deal is abortion rights. And after the Texas Supreme Court ruling as regards Texas, this issue has risen very high up. And McAuliffe has taken it very seriously. He's made it much more central to his campaigning, running against an anti-choice Republican. My sense is that when all is said and done, the combination of the mobilization, as well as McAuliffe's focus on a couple of frankly hot button and important issues, are likely to put him into a relatively comfortable place come November. But Democrats can't take any of these races casually. I was talking to Governor Murphy in New Jersey last week, and he's been a very effective governor, very impressive and frankly very popular governor. But he's taking his reelection race very, very seriously. And I think that's the nature of the moment that we're in. Off-year elections in a moment like this, especially at a time where we've got Delta variant surge, where we've got challenges in Washington, whether you like it or not, are races that can't be taken for granted. And perhaps the good news for Democrats is that both McAuliffe and Governor Murphy are pretty savvy about politics. And my sense is that this should be a reasonably good year for Democrats in these off years. But
if get organized. We're going to take another short.
Sorry.
Break now. We'll be back with more of John Nichols as we bring back our radio audience. Welcome back to Deadline DC. Our guest in this half hour is John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. If we're back with our radio audience now, if you're in our radio audience and you'd like to see us as well as hear us, you may want to see John Nichols. Whether you want to see me or not is an open question. You can watch us on Periscope TV at periscope.tv/Brad Bannon. You can watch us on Facebook Live at tinyurl.com/BB Facebook Live. And you can also see us on YouTube at tinyurl.com/Brad on YouTube. John, you were just about to finish a thought on the this year's gubernatorial races before I rudely interrupted you.
Well, you weren't rude at all, and but we were talking kind of in the break about the 2021 races, and there are two gubernatorial races this year. One in Virginia, which is closer, with Terry McAuliffe as the Democratic nominee. One in New Jersey, which is looks to be an easier race for Governor Murphy up there. What I would say is, are you still there, Brad? Can you see
I
me?
am here, but we've lost our video for you, John.
All right. Well, that's not good. Let's see what we could do to restabilize or re-up that.
I can hear you, so you
I
can
think
keep
that might
talking.
help. Not sure what's going on here, Brad.
Well, why don't we keep? Why don't you keep
Can you
talking?
see me now?
John?
Brad, are you there? Okay. Sorry, my apologies on the video. Look, what I was saying is that it's important to remember that in off-year elections like this, especially following the election of a political party to office, this being the Democrats in this case, the opposition party usually does very, very well. And so what both Murphy in New Jersey and McAuliffe in Virginia are trying to do is to beat the off-year curse. I think there's a lot of good evidence that they can, but this is something that Democrats can't take casually. And I think that's why, A, they have to do a lot of mobilization, especially in Virginia. B, I think they have to recognize the rising issues of the moment. And as we referenced in the break, the real rising issue, especially in Virginia, I think is going to be abortion rights. And coming off the Supreme Court's ruling as regards Texas, my sense is that a focus on defending abortion rights is very probably, although not certainly, going to win it for McAuliffe.
Our guest in this half hour is John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. John, you there?
I am here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
You brought up my next the next subject I wanted to talk about with Texas. We had a report yesterday in several news outlets that former Congressman and Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke had decided he was going to run and would announce his candidacy officially later this year. Now, Texas is kind of a frustrating place, and even more frustrating lately. There's a surge in the minority population. If you look at the 2020 census estimates, the largest Hispanic increase in population occurred in Texas, more so than any other state. The largest Asian increase in population occurred in Texas compared to the other 49 states. African Americans had the second biggest population growth in the nation in Texas. And we keep talking about Democrats breaking the Republican stranglehold on the Lone Star State. Is next year the year it might happen?
Yes, it is the year that it might happen, but it's certainly not assured. The reason it might happen is a variety of issues that have come into play that might actually shift the kind of last group of voters that need to be shifted in order to make this happen and also contribute to a mobilization. On one side, you've got the abortion issue, and the abortion issue has a potential to shift suburban women who have already been shifting somewhat to the Democratic Party in Texas and states around the country, and to really move more of them. If that happens, that could be very, very helpful to the Democrats. But it's not the only issue there. And I think it's important to recognize that under Governor Greg Abbott, Texas has gone from disaster to disaster. Just a matter of months ago, they had the power grid kind of meltdown, which caused terrible crisis across the state. It was clearly the result of, frankly, a very corrupt and mangled system that the Republicans have managed to the advantage of their campaign contributors and, frankly, to the advantage of the corporations with which they're aligned. If Beto O'Rourke runs for governor and runs as a candidate who is committed to just sensibly running the state government and not running it in the sort of corrupt and dysfunctional way that Republicans have for so long, and also does emphasize a more rational approach to social issues, particularly reproductive rights, there's a real potential there. Again, you're talking about the midterm curse, so to speak, which is that usually the party of the sitting president does not do all that well in midterms. So we have to, look for scenarios where this might be a different situation because of the extremism of the Republican Party, and frankly, because of some failings by particular political figures in Texas, led by Governor Abbott. But I think O'Rourke's getting into the race is a huge deal. And I also think he was cautious about getting into the race. He wasn't rushing to do it for much of this year. So my sense is that he is doing it based on polling, based on some real sense that this is a possible race. And I do not underestimate Beto O'Rourke in Texas. I watched him campaign in 2018 there, and I was powerfully struck by what a very capable candidate he was, and frankly, by the coalition that he built, one that came within a whisker of defeating Ted Cruz.
Yeah. And there's also a wild card. We have actor Matthew McConaughey who's talking about running for governor.
Yeah, but that's probably the truth of the matter is if McConaughey gets in, that probably helps Greg Abbott because one presumes that McConaughey draws from a portion of voters who are not in the hard right Republican base. And because Texas does have a lot of very hard right Republican voters, the idea of dividing the electorate, having McConaughey in there and O'Rourke in there, I think would probably be something that Abbott would like.
Okay. John, thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. I hope you can come back soon. Our guest in this half hour was John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. We'll be back in our second half hour on Deadline DC. We'll be talking to Dr. Robert Shapiro, an economist who will give us an update on the status of the economy and talk about the need for Build Back Better. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Deadline DC with Brad Bannon after these messages with Dr. Robert Shapiro, and we'll talk about the economy and economic issues.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Pleasure joining you. Sorry about the camera.
Hey, Dad,
went out.
how do airplanes fly?
That's all right. We got your
box?
mellifluous voice.
Can I touch this?
We'll do.
Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided, but there's a place where people are coming together.
I gotta tell you, I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too, but I'm glad we are.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and life experiences come together through conversation, and it feels good.
Wow, your story is so...
Interesting?
Yeah.
When people actually sit down, talk, and listen to one another, they can break down boundaries and connect as human beings. At lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep, you can listen to amazing, life-changing conversations and find simple tools to start a conversation of your own.
I know one thing. This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope, too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together by having the courage to start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
We've got the Academy Awards, the Emmys, and Grammys. But what should we call the award for the most extraordinary performance by a corporate profiteer? How about the Sleazy, with winners getting a solid gold sculpture of a middle finger? There were so many worthy contenders, but one corporation exhibited uncommon callousness, so the 2021 Sleazy goes to Tyson Foods. The meatpacking giant has regularly run roughshod over workers, farmers, communities, and the environment, not to mention the millions of animals it fattens and slaughters. But the coronavirus pulled out the worst in Tyson's corporate ethic. Last April, its billionaire chair, John Tyson, ranted that health officials who were closing down several of his slaughterhouses that had become hotbeds of contagion were creating another crisis, a national meat shortage. Responding instantly, our corporate compassionate, burger-gobbling president decreed that meatpacking plants were crucial to America's national security and must be kept open at all cost. Trump's edict required workers to return to their jobs or be fired. Only there was no meat shortage. Indeed, Tyson and other giants actually increased their meat exports to China last year. Meanwhile, COVID rampaged through Tyson's factories. In its Waterloo, Iowa facility alone, a third of the processing workers were infected and at least 6 died. Which brings us to the corporate play that cinched this year's Sleazy for Tyson. Waterloo slaughterhouse supervisors actually knew that the back-to-work order would sicken hundreds, but not exactly how many. So, managers organized a winner-take-all betting pool on the percent of employees who would test positive. It was simply something fun, said one, kind of a morale boost. This is Jim Hightower saying the virus infected more than a third of the workers in the plant. Some fun, huh?
Welcome back to Deadline DC. But before we get to our guest, Dr. Robert Shapiro, we're going to hear this from President Biden.
55 most profitable corporations in America paid 0 in federal income taxes on what amounted to $40 billion in profit. Not a penny. That's not right. My economic plan will change that. Not punish anybody, just make them pay their fair share. But my Republican friends in Congress don't want to change the law. So what are they doing? They're attacking me and my plan, which is fine. But if you're going to have a debate, let's have an honest debate. My Republican friends are attacking my plan, saying it's big spending. Let me remind you, these are the same folks who just 4 years ago passed the Trump tax cut, totaling almost $2 trillion in tax cuts. A giant giveaway to the largest corporations in the top 1%. And listen to this, almost none of that $2 trillion tax cut was paid for. It just ballooned the federal deficit. In fact, the unpaid bills racked up by the last administration are projected to increase the national debt by more than $8 trillion over time. What I'm proposing is totally different from that approach for 3 reasons. First, my plan is paid for. It's fiscally responsible because our investments are paid for by making sure that corporations and wealthy Americans pay their fair share. Second, we're not going to raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000. That's a lot of money. Some of my liberal friends are saying it should be lower than that. But only corporations and people making over $400,000 a year are going to pay any additional tax. And third, not only will no one making under $400,000 see their taxes go up, the middle class are going to get some tax cuts, some breaks. My plan benefits ordinary Americans, not those at the top who don't need the help. It's a historic middle class tax cut, cutting taxes for over 50 million families.
That was President Biden talking about his tax plan that would fund his Build Back Better program. This half hour of Deadline DC is brought to you by Bannon, my company, Bannon Communications Research, which polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Ironically, President Biden's job rating has declined as the economy has inclined. Cash-strapped working families needed a big boost, and President Biden deserves credits for his efforts to fix the failed Trump economy. Passage of the big and bold Build Back Better bill would continue and deepen the recovery that's already started. The new law would also guarantee that he gets credit for the success in turning the page on Donald Trump's failure to fight the pandemic, which kneecapped the economy. You can read the rest of this column and all my columns for The Hill at muckrack.com/Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, Chairman of Sonecon, an economic advisory firm and a senior fellow of the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is an internationally known economist who has advised several prominent national Democrats on economic policy. He was also Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs in the Clinton administration. Dr. Shapiro, welcome back to Deadline DC.
It's a pleasure, Brad.
First start, could you give us a status update on the condition of the economy? Where generally is the economy right now?
The economy is doing well. It's not doing quite as well as we thought it would a couple months ago, and that's because the Delta surge is dampening economic activity. And however, I think the administration has finally put in place a really robust plan to get to 75 to 80% of all Americans vaccinated, which is what we need to be able to go back to kind of normal life. I think the president hoped that this could happen without mandates, and he was wrong. And so he's course corrected and put in place mandates, which is what we need, and mandates which are the norm when you have epidemics or when you have highly infectious diseases that can affect very large numbers of people and with very serious consequences. We don't do it for all infectious diseases, but we certainly do it for epidemics. And I think if the administration can be criticized for anything, it was for its optimism that that we could achieve that 75 to 80% of all Americans vaccinated without a mandate.
Yeah, and fortunately, you know, one of the things actually we talked about the lessons we could learn from the California recall in the first half hour with John Nichols. But one of the things that's pretty clear looking at the exit polls from the California recall is that the biggest issue among Californians who voted in the recall was the pandemic. And 80% of the Californians who voted in the recall, who were concerned about the pandemic, voted to retain Gavin Newsom. So I think that's, as well as learning an economic lesson, we can learn a political lesson too about the need for strong, aggressive measures to fight the rise of the Delta variant.
Well, and I mean, that's absolutely correct. I agree. And if you look at the national polls, the fact is Biden was elected to be two things. One, to end the pandemic, and two, to not be Donald Trump. And the fact is that they underestimated what would be required for the first, given the really unprecedented kind of fantasy world that Trump's base has lived in with regard to the pandemic. And so, you know, I think he was, look, Joe Biden has always been a very optimistic kind of guy. Well, this time he needed to be a little more realistic or cynical, frankly.
Okay. Let's move on. There are a number of things, of course. Right now, Congress is battling over the president's proposal to rebuild the infrastructure. One of the things that's going on, which relates to that, is right now there is a battle, especially in the Senate, over the debt limit. Could you explain that to our viewers and listeners? Because I think it's something that most people don't understand and they're going to hear a lot about in the next couple of weeks.
Certainly. The debt limit is a limit on the amount of Treasury securities that the Treasury can issue in order to finance deficits and to refinance debt which has been which is matured and is being rolled over. And it's really about paying for the commitments that we've already made. And this used to be a non-controversial issue for many decades. Everyone recognized that, of course, you had to raise the debt limit, because if you didn't, the government would not be able to pay its bills. And not only that, if it couldn't pay its bills, then it would, in effect, begin defaulting on debt. And by defaulting on debt, interest rates would rise sharply because foreign investors would lose confidence in the U.S. government's willingness to pay for its spending. And so it has become a kind of occasion for the opposition party to extract some concessions. That was what happened with Obama. And
okay.
But
I'm going to have to interrupt you, Rob, but we're going to break. Our guest in this half hour of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon is the noted economist, Dr. Robert Shapiro. We'll be back after these messages. And for our radio listeners, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. For our TV listeners, viewers, we're not going anywhere, so don't you either.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes you just gotta hold on and know.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, the noted economist. If you'd like to talk to Dr. Shapiro, his Twitter handle is Rob Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro, now we were talking about the debt limit. Mitch McConnell says that he doesn't want to give any help raising the debt limit, which he did 3 times for Donald Trump, by the way, not that anybody's counting. But the Democrats are going to have to do it on their own. Is this just Mitch McConnell playing his favorite role as obstructionist?
Well, it's Mitch McConnell playing his favorite role of giving Republican candidates an attack line. And the attack line is Democrats added, what, $5 trillion or whatever is the number, to the debt, which is what they'll say, using the debt limit. And this is kind of standard partisan politics. It would be really troublesome if we didn't believe that the Democrats can pass it without Republican votes. And that either means that McConnell has to agree to not filibuster a bill to raise the debt limit, or you've got to attach it to reconciliation. And it certainly could be attached to the infrastructure bill, which still has not, it's been passed in each house, but they're still working out the final passage of it, which has to do with disagreements over the Build Back Better bill. Well, the fact is the Democrats are going to have to get their act together and pass that infrastructure bill with the debt limit attached to it. And there really is no other choice. Even if the Republicans, quote unquote, caused a debt default, the president is always responsible. And so there is no realistic alternative. A debt default would be, I don't want to say catastrophic, but it would have very serious negative consequences. It would upend the economy.
Okay. Our guest in this half hour is the noted economist, Dr. Robert Shapiro. We're going to take a very short break now to bring back our radio listeners. But when we return, we'll have more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and Dr. Shapiro, and we'll talk about the prospects for and the politics behind Joe Biden's Build Back Better bill, which is, and it seems to me the whole process is Byzantine. We've got a couple of Democrats, and we want to talk about those Democrat senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and Karen Sinema of Arizona, who are playing hard to get. We'll be right back with more Deadline DC after these messages. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour to talk about the economy and Build Back Better is Dr. Robert Shapiro, who is an expert on economics and occasionally comes on Deadline DC to try to make sense of this, which some people call the dismal science to our listeners. Okay, now let's get this, let me try to get this straight. There are 2 competing infrastructure proposals. One is a $1.2 trillion package that was passed by a bipartisan majority in the Senate. Now, to me, it looks like that package is heavy on what you call traditional infrastructure, bridges, roads, mass transit, airports, and light on everything else that's important. Then you have the president's proposal, which is about 3 times as expensive, $3.5 trillion over 10 years, which has the traditional infrastructure things in it, but also has its dynamic package with provisions to fight climate change, to provide for human infrastructure, Can you explain the differences between the two packages, Rob?
Certainly. The first package, it is called 1.2 trillion. It's actually, it is that size, but about half the money is actually coming from funds that went to the states for various pandemic-related programs like rent relief, for example, and the states didn't use the money. So they're repurposing, half of that is repurposed money. The rest is very traditional infrastructure, which we need. Roads, bridges, it also includes a lot of money for the electric grid, to modernize the electric grid, as well as broadband, hopefully universal broadband. The second bill, the reconciliation bill, that looks mainly at what are called human infrastructure, things which make people more productive. So, for example, guaranteed pre-K education, no-cost community college tuition, childcare support so that people can know their children will be taken care of well so they can work. These are, as well as a lot of climate-related provisions. And this is whereas the first is a fairly traditional effort, the one, incidentally, which failed in the last two administrations. So it's a real achievement. The second is a expansion of the government's role in supporting people's lives, and in particular the education and the trade-offs between family life and work life, which are so difficult for so many people. And it's very ambitious. They're really, within the Democratic caucus in both the House and the Senate, and frankly, there's as much difficulty with this bill in the House as there is in the Senate. The difficulty is not over the fundamental concept that this has become necessary responsibilities for government, but rather over the initial dimensions of it. I think if the administration agreed to a $2.5 trillion package, for example, you wouldn't have any problem from the moderates. You would have some problems from the progressives, the progressive caucus on the left. And this highlights the fundamental challenge that faces Joe Biden, and that is he has a very ambitious agenda when he has an effective majority of one in the Senate because of the vice president's ability to break ties, and an effective majority of about 3 in the House. The last time a president tried to be this ambitious, it was Lyndon Johnson and FDR. And they both had enormous Democratic majorities in both houses. So this is a very difficult nut to crack, given the closeness of the majority. And frankly, the moderates and the progressives have got to both accept that they will not get everything they want and be prepared to accept what they can get, which will be enormous. It just will not be as enormous as Bernie Sanders would have liked.
Okay. Now, let's say that a package passes. We've got, let's say it's about $2.5 trillion. Now, it seems to me there are really three parts to this. You got your traditional infrastructure things, roads, bridges. You've got what is called provisions for human infrastructure, and I would say guaranteed uh, K through 12 pre-K education is part of that. And then you've got the money in there basically to fight climate change and to make, as some people say, build it back greener. What would a $2.5 trillion package as opposed to a $3.5 trillion package mean sacrificing?
Well, frankly, you don't need to sacrifice anything.
Okay.
If you phase everything in much more gradually. And that would put some of the 3.5 trillion beyond the 10-year budget window. So you could have a $2.5 trillion package over 8 or 10 years. That was a $3.5 trillion package over 12 or 13 years. So that's one way to do it. The other is, there are, like any large piece of legislation, this one includes some provisions that benefit very influential groups and very influential industries. We could probably save, I don't know, a couple $100 billion by eliminating them. It might make it harder to pass, however. The other thing which could really create a kind of boundary on this, and I think it's probably the right boundary, is to approach it through the revenues. I think if you had $3.5 trillion in revenues that you could get Democrats to agree on, they'd be happy to spend the $3.5 trillion, including Manchin and Sinema.
Okay.
But getting the agreement on taxes is as hard as getting the agreement on spending. My guess is, if anything were to fall out, it is most likely to be the education agenda. And that would be terrible. But it is the least organized. It has the least well-organized constituency. And, there are also very important healthcare provisions in this bill that expand Obamacare supports and also expand benefits received under Medicare. I think we could, I think we should have those benefits, but Medicare has done fine without them for a long time. We could put it off a little.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on Deadline DC to try to explain the murky area of economics to our viewers and listeners. And I'm sure there's going to be much more about this, and we hope to have you back soon.
Anytime.
I want to thank you, Rob. I want to thank all our guests, John Nichols from The Nation, economist Dr. Robert Shapiro, and a special shout out to our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. Make sure you listen to Leslie. She'll be back tomorrow. Be safe and be strong in these troubled times, and make sure you turn into Deadline DC every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, or the podcast anytime on periscope.tv/Brad Bannon.